Well, it's good at the beginning of a new year to take time to prepare and think about what's coming ahead. Now, there are lots of ways that we do that. One of the most common ways is through New Year's resolution. Now, I'm curious, how many of you, raise the hands, typically do a New Year's resolution? Very many of you? Okay, yeah, there's some of you. How many typically don't do that? Seems like more of you don't, but some of you do. I thought about asking, now that we're a week into 2024, how many have already bailed on your New Year's resolution? But I won't ask that. Well, I do know from what I've read that if you're going to do a New Year's resolution, it's important that they're achievable. And so I found some that I thought would share with you. You know, maybe you're a little late to creating some resolutions. So I just wanted to share a couple of these before as we start a new year. So first of all, I think most of us probably could stand to exercise more. And so here's a good one for you. Or most of us probably need, at least I do, need to drink less coffee. Or I know I could be more focused, really focus on my priorities this year. Or I maybe just need to be more relaxed about life. And to be clear, that's for people that like to wear shorts, not just going around without pants. That would be really awkward. I think a good New Year's resolution for all of us is just to try to be nicer to people. And then maybe we just need to let go of our expectations altogether. Sorry, you got a little glimpse into my very strange sense of humor, but I found those funny and thought I'm going to inflict those upon you as we kick off a new year because it is good for us to laugh. But why, I'm curious, and on a serious note, why do we make New Year's resolutions? Why do we think in these ways? And I think there's a couple of reasons that we do that. First of all, I think as we begin a new year, we think about, I want to be better, or how can I be better? How can I take steps to improve myself? And that's not a bad thing, to reflect and do some self-reflection on myself. I also think that we would like life to go better. And sometimes as we think ahead, as we prepare, as we begin to live differently, life goes better. That's why last year when we kicked off the year, we talked about the series Breathing Room. And we talked and challenged you to think about how much room do you have in your life to really focus on those important relationships? How much room do you have in your life financially? How much time do you have? And we began to get you thinking to prepare as you walk into the year ahead. And this year, we wanted to kick off the year a little bit differently, thinking about the year ahead. Now, I don't know what you're thinking about as you look into 2024, but as I look down the road, there's a couple of big events in our family's life. We've got 2 weddings coming up. My wife and I are going to be part of a mission trip to India, so some big events coming up. And I think it helps me as I look ahead to prepare for the future and think about what's ahead. And one of the things that I think we're all going to experience in 2024, whether they're big or small, is we're going to experience some of the storms of life. And I think the storms of life come in a couple of varieties. I think there's the normal day-to-day storms that we all experience, normal things which happen that can be frustrating and just kind of set us off course. Like you head out to work in the morning. For those of us that still drive to work, you get in your car and then you find out your battery is dead. That happened to me on Tuesday. For those of you who have parents with little kids, you get ready to leave the house. And my kids are all grown, but I remember the days you get ready to leave the house and suddenly somebody's diaper needs change. You've got everybody loaded up. Or you've got a big meeting and you really need to get a good night's sleep. And your kids are waking up through the night. Those are the little storms of life. Or if you're a student and your homework's due at midnight, and students, I know some of you are just jumping back in, so I'm going to kind of help you mentally get there for next week, but your homework's due at midnight and your computer crashes at 11:45, or maybe the internet goes down and your assignment's late, and then you have to deal with your teacher and explain why your homework is late. But we all experience the normal day-to-day frustrations of life in whatever flavor that they come in. And then for some of us in 2024, we'll experience some big storms of life, things that shake our lives and our world. And this could be a whole variety of things. It could be loss of somebody important to us or an important relationship, a loss of a spouse, a friend, a parent, or another family member. And this past week, we kicked off Grief Share, and the leaders of Grief Share were shocked at how many people signed up and showed up for Grief Share, because some of those people in 2023 had experienced life-altering storms. But those aren't the only storms that we face. There's illness, there's things like loss of jobs, and the list goes on and on of things that can shake us. And so reality number one is we're going to all experience storms of life in 2024. And I think that's important for us just to get that, to just kind of be ready for that. But there's a second reality that I think that we need to pay attention to as well, is that we all look for something to anchor us when the storms hit. And again, there's a variety of things that I think we go to, that we look to. It could be people or a relationship. It could be our reputation or what people think about us. There could be something that soothes us or just allows us to escape and get a little bit of relief, either sports or gaming or a hobby. There are lots of things that we look to anchor us when those storms hit. Now, that's not an exhaustive list, but what I wish is we could sit down and have a conversation and say, where do you go to? What's your anchor when the storms of life hit? Where do you go when life becomes difficult or challenging or something unexpected happens? Now, I'm not a mariner, but a long time ago, our family owned a small little boat. It was a little fishing boat, and it was just kind of big enough. It fit Susie and I and 4 little kids, and we floated down the right river at one point. Story for another day. It was a 3-hour adventure that turned into a 6-hour adventure, one of those family memories. But we had an anchor with this boat, and again, I'm not a mariner, probably most of you are not as well, but just quick review about what an anchor does. I mean, we kind of know the basic idea. An anchor is there to keep you in one place. If you're out fishing, and I enjoy fishing, an anchor will help keep you in one spot. So as the wind and the waves start to pull you, as the currents start to try to push your boat, an anchor will hold you in place. An anchor brings stability to an unstable situation. Now, again, there's actually a couple of things that make an anchor work. And if you don't have these 3 things, then the anchor's not going to work. And I brought up here a little anchor. And the first part of an anchor is it's got something heavy that is going to drop to the bottom when you drop it out off your boat. And the purpose of that anchor is to get to the bottom and connect with something heavy. But that's only the first part of the anchor. The second part is you've got some sort of line that's connected to the anchor, and you can then, the third part is the connection. You're hanging on to this line or rope or chain or whatever it is, and that's the third part of the anchor, is you're going to tie that to something, you're going to hang on to it, and then you, by the line, are connected to the thing that will keep you from moving. Now, you've got to have all 3 parts or the anchor doesn't work. If the anchor's not connected to something solid, you move. If you drop an anchor in and it doesn't have the line, we just call that a splash, and it just makes a nice noise and goes down. And if you don't hang on to the anchor line or you don't stay connected with it, you're going to begin to drift. Now, here's why we're doing this series in 2024. We want to get you thinking, like I said, about what you're anchored to. And the challenge is for you to anchor yourself to something in 2024 that will hold during the big or the small storms of life. And because we believe that God is the only true anchor, we're going to talk about 3 things that are going to help us anchor. And we're going to alliterate to help you remember, and all these things begin with the letter P. And the first is the person of God. Our anchor holds firm to the bedrock of God's character. And each week we're going to talk about a characteristic of who God is, what's true about who he is. But then the second P is the promise. There's promises in Scripture that we can begin to hold on to and that'll allow us to be our anchor line. And then the last thing is a practice. We're going to give you some practices each week to allow you to practically say, how do I hold on to that truth? How do I hold on to that promise and allow me to stay anchored? And a way to think about this is our regular practices of devotion connect us to God's promises, which anchor us to the person of God. Our regular practices of devotion connect us to God's promises, which anchor us to the person of God. As we experience the storms of life, we want to be safely anchored by our trust and hope in God and His promises. Now, the reason that we use this term anchor, it's, again, an anchor is a great image of something that holds us, but as we started to do a little research, what I didn't realize is that the anchor was an important symbol in the early church. In fact, from the end of the first century to the middle of the third century, it was a symbol that the church often used to identify, and it was a symbol that they used. And it was during a time of persecution, and Jesus' followers had to meet in secret. They couldn't meet openly because there was a lot of persecution going on. And I think it's easy to think about, well, we a lot of times use the cross as our symbol, but this was a time that the cross, for multiple reasons, would not have been a great symbol. I mean, they were still seeing friends that were persecuted and in some cases crucified. And there's a lot of reasons that the anchor became an important symbol, but if you want to know a little bit more of the history, there's a link in the Grace Fishers app in the sermon notes that's got a little bit. It's a fascinating article that kind of highlights and then looks at some other resources. But the main reason that the anchor became a symbol from the early church comes from a verse that's in the book of Hebrews chapter 6, verse 19. And so that's a great segue to grab a Bible or load up your Bible app, and we're actually going to start in Hebrews chapter 1. And if you're using one of our Bibles that are in the seat in front of you, it's on page 1009, or 1009. So as you turn there, a little bit of background on the book of Hebrews. Now, the title might suggest that this was written to Jews or Jewish Christians, but it was written to the early church and would have included both a mix of Jewish and Gentile Christians, those people who were not Jewish. This was a group of believers who had faced the storms of life of persecution because their faith and this faith that they were beginning to live out was foreign in their world, and some, because of the persecution, had given up their faith. And the main idea behind this sermon is persevering in hope while facing the storms of life as a disciple of Jesus. And I've spent about the last month reading through this book of Hebrews, which is actually a sermon, and I was reminded how much I absolutely love this book. And so you're going to get a lot of scripture. We're going to go through it pretty quickly, but since I can't read the whole book of Hebrews this morning, I want to highlight 3 key ideas that I think speak to this idea of what the book of Hebrews talks about, and particularly this idea of how we're anchored. And the first idea is simply this: God communicates who He is through the person of Jesus. And we see this in the very first line in Hebrews chapter 1, the first few verses. Long ago, God spoke many times and in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets. And now in these final days, He's spoken to us through His Son. Now, initially, God spoke through men and women. He spoke through the prophets, and we still have their words. He actually tried to speak to His people as well, and you'll see this referenced in the book of Hebrews. He talks about the priests and the whole temple system, and it was kind of a shadow, and it was trying to teach them image of how they could approach God. There are even references in the book of Hebrews to angels, and I won't get into all that, but I'd forgotten how much angels are referenced because at times they served as God's messengers. But what the book of Hebrews is clear about over and over again is God's best and primary form of communication to us was in the person of Jesus. Because as the Gospel of John chapter 1 says, when Jesus walked among us, we could understand who God was in a way that we could understand more clearly, because Jesus was fully God and fully man. And I think it's important for us to begin to say God is trying to speak to us. And if you're trying to explore your faith, maybe you haven't fully figured out who Jesus is, a challenge to you in 2024 would be to start to figure out, who is Jesus and what does he want to say to me? So that's the first big idea. And the second big idea is that we need to anchor ourselves to the truth, or we may drift away. And one of the other things that struck me as I was reading in Hebrews is how many times there's warnings, like in Hebrews 2, verse 1. It says, so we must listen very carefully to the truth we have heard, or we may drift away from it. And then in chapter 6, verse 11, it says it a little different way, and it's not just about remembering truth, but actively living it. It says, keep on loving others as long as life lasts, in order to make certain that what you hope for will come true. Then you will not become spiritually dull and indifferent. And I don't know about you, but there have been seasons in my life where if I wasn't holding on to Jesus in the way I should, I became spiritually dull and I became indifferent to people around me and to the things of God. And like everything of value in our life, if we don't hold on to the truth of who God is and what Jesus has come in our life, we are going to be swept away by the currents of this world, the winds of changing opinions. And so we have to learn how to hold on. And Hebrews reminds us that we need to hold on. And then there's a third big idea, and this really gets to the heart of the book of Hebrews. And it's this idea that God is an unchanging promise keeper who brings hope. Now, in chapter 6, it begins with a story, and I'm just going to do kind of a brief summary, but it talks about a man named Abraham that a long time ago God made a promise to. And God said to Abraham, I will bless you. And it was in this promise to Abraham that what God's desire wasn't just to bless Abraham, but he wanted to bless this world, and he wanted to restore his creation, which had been broken. And we're told that Abraham waited patiently, he trusted God, and he eventually received what God had promised him. Now, what I want to qualify is that if you understand the story of Abraham's life, he waited patiently but imperfectly. It didn't fully depend on Abraham. It depended on God's work. And he received what was promised, but he only got a small taste of it. Because a little bit later in verse 6, we see how God ultimately fulfilled his promise to Abraham and how he was a promise keeper. And in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 16, we begin to see this. We see the rest of the story of this promise unfold. Now, when people take an oath, they call on someone greater than themselves to hold them to it. And without any question, that oath is binding. God also bound himself with an oath so that those who received the promise would be perfectly sure that he would never change his mind. You see, God made a promise to Abraham, and then he made a covenant with Abraham that he said, I'm going to deliver on the promise that I've made to you. And Hebrews 6 reminds us that when God promises something, he comes through, because God himself is unchanging. And in a world where everything is changes, in fact, the rate of change in our world continues to accelerate, God never changed. He's the anchor point in a world that continues to swirl and change and bring challenge to our lives. The writer goes on to say this, so God has given us his promise and his oath. These two things are unchangeable because it is impossible for God to lie. Therefore, we who have fled to him for refuge can have great confidence as we hold to the hope that lies before us. This hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. And Jesus has gone in there already, in there for us. He has become our eternal high priest in the order of Melchizedek. These words or this passage reminds us that we can have great confidence because God is a promise keeper. and that this hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. Now, there's some Old Testament imagery of what the priest would do as they would enter into the temple there in Jerusalem, and they would enter into the presence of God, and they had to do this over and over and over. But because Jesus' life and death and resurrection, he gives us unlimited access to God, and so we don't have to go through a priest. We have unlimited access to God. And Hebrews 2 tells us this. He says, because God's children are human beings made of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death. Only in this way could he set free all who have lived their lives as slaves to the fear of dying. You see, because of Jesus' death and resurrection, because he's entered into the holy place, he has set us free. We are no longer slaves. This is a really great hope. And that leads us to this promise that we have because of Jesus. Because of Jesus, we have unlimited access to God, and he promises to provide us comfort and redemption and salvation in this life, even in the storms that we face. And so we need to learn to hold on to that promise, and that's what Hebrews challenges us to do. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 23, the writer tells us, let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope that we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise. Now, I'm going to go back to this visual of an anchor again, and what we're anchored to really matters. And I've got another little prop here. I've got a couple lines for us. If I'm anchored to something and a storm comes along or the current comes along and I pull, it doesn't do me much good. And we've probably all experienced times in our life when we were leaning on something, when we thought this is the thing that I'm going to hold on to, and that person, that thing that I thought was going to bring me safety or relief didn't hold. But God reminds us in the book of Hebrews that if we anchor ourselves to him, that it's a line that we can hold on and that we can trust in. And he's an anchor that will hold. So how do we do this practically? Hebrews 12:1 tells us, and this is where we get super practical. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. Let us run with endurance the race that God has set before us. Now here the writer changes metaphors a little bit in verse 12:1. He talks about this crowd of witnesses that would surround us. And actually in chapter 11, it's a beautiful chapter of people of faith who have been faithfully trusted in God. And some of those are like Abraham, experienced victory. But there's also those who experience great difficulty and suffering. And it's a reminder that a life of faith is not always easy, but it often comes with suffering and challenge. But we can learn from those who have gone before us and were faithful. And this is a part of why we love to tell stories here, because when we see it in other people's lives, we see how they've anchored themselves into the storms of life. It helps us learn how to hold on to the anchor line of Jesus. It's part of why on December 31st, last Sunday, we told 3 stories. And if you didn't get a chance to watch that service, I would encourage you to go back and listen to those stories of people who have been through different storms and challenges and figured out how to hold on and how God was faithful in their lives. So it helps us to see people around us. It also helps us if we let go of things that are slowing us down. And there may be things in our life that are slowing us down, that are keeping us from holding on. But I want to move on to the key in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, where the writer says this. He says, we do this, we anchor ourselves by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. You see, we can look at people of faith all around us and we can learn from them, but our ultimate example is Jesus, who has gone before us, who had run the race perfectly, and who freed us and allows us to go into God's presence. And this image of him sitting down is a picture of that work of completion. And we can rest like Josh encourages us to rest because of the perfect work that Jesus has accomplished. So how do we do this? How do we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus? Well, like everything else in our life, it's going to require some practice. And so this month, during this series, each week, we're going to give you one or two practices. And these are going to be contemplative practices. And contemplative is a word that we don't use every day. And it simply means to think deeply or to think in a serious or calm manner. So we're going to give you some practices that just help you reflect on how do we anchor ourselves in the promises of God. And these practices are there to help us align our heart through reflection and trust of God. These are practices that have been used since the early days of the church, and they're seen in the lives of Jesus himself. And so what we want to encourage you as we give you these practices is to try them. Because some of these practices will work better for you depending on your stage of life, who you are, and how God has wired you. But that's what we want to do, is challenge you to practice these things. Because, you know, it's easy as we go through this life to settle into two extremes in the way we engage with this world. We can either hide or shelter in place from all that's going around in the world, or we can carry those burdens and quickly become overwhelmed by the challenges and burdens of life. And like writer John Eldredge says, what we need is a little bit of benevolent detachment. We need some space where we can retreat, where we can refresh our perspective, and when we can hear from God what's true about us and about this world. And so 2 simple exercises for you to try this week. The first one is simply to be still. I want to challenge you to try at least once, and I'd encourage you to try it multiple times, to sit quietly for 3 minutes and just listen. And you'll find, at least for me, this is incredibly difficult to do. And it's a practice that I too do regularly. I actually set a timer because I get distracted. I go in rabbit trails. And simply enter into this time and invite God to speak to you, and then sit and listen. And it requires practice, and the more I do it, the better I get at it. You know, I was reflecting as Susie and I were both very busy people with our life and ministry, and I recognize, you know, sometimes we struggle to communicate with one another, and I think this happens most of all in the kitchen. We're getting dinner ready, and we're trying to debrief the day, and we're constantly moving, and it's hard to hear what one another are saying because we're constantly moving. And when we sit down and we're face to face with one another, we can have a conversation and we can hear. And that's what this is. It's simply being still and inviting God to speak to you. And then the second thing I would challenge you to do, and some of these practices are going to be really easy and simple, but they're ways for you to center and learn to hold on to that hope. And that's simply to pray a breath prayer. And this is kind of a simple one-sentence prayer that you might pray. You might pray if Psalm 23 is important to you and you're a season where you need to sense God's closeness. It might be something simple like, Lord, you're my shepherd. Or you might pray, let me know your peace, O God. Or like I've been praying the last couple of weeks from Psalm 25, you are the God who saves me. It's just a simple little reminder of who God is. And again, if you need a little more detail on what breath prayers are, if you look in the Grace Fishers app under sermon notes, there's some ideas and some things. But I would challenge you to pick a simple phrase to remember over the week ahead that helps you recenter and refocus on who God is. Because as we enter 2024, whether you're young in your faith or you've been walking with Jesus a long time, I want to encourage you to stay anchored. Whether 2024 is exciting and there's tons of potential, or maybe whether you see the storms of life coming, I want to challenge you to stay anchored. And I want to just invite God to do that for us right now. And I'm just going to take a couple of moments of silence, and then I'm going to pray for us. God, as we enter into 2024, my simple prayer is this, and I've been praying this for myself. Let us hold on to you. Let us fix our eyes on you. Let us remember what you say is true about us. Let us remember what's true about this world. And Father, in the words of Psalm 25 that Josh read earlier, show me the right path, O Lord. Show us the right path. Point out the road for us to follow. Lead us by your truth and teach us. For you are the God who saves us. And all day long, we put our hope in you.